Hello and welcome to Designing Space. I'm Carol Mason. I'm a neuroscientist and professor here at Columbia. I actually belong to three departments in the medical school, but I am currently in the Zuckerman Institute and chair of inter-school planning, trying to bring people together here at Columbia. I am very pleased to be the interim chair of the Presidential Scholars in Society of Neuroscience, subbing for Pamela Smith, who's actually here in the audience. So you can meet her later. And the Presidential Scholars Series, which I'll explain in a minute, is part of Columbia University's initiative to foster interdisciplinary perspectives on the mind, brain, and behavior research. So we're very delighted today, actually, to collaborate with three partners: the Italian Academy for Advanced Studies in America, the Zuckerman Institute, which I'm part of, and the Graduate School of Architecture, Planning, and Preservation. If you're new to our seminars in society and neuroscience, let me briefly introduce you to our Presidential Scholars Program and the Center for Science and Society. So this wonderful graphic is to represent the Presidential Scholars in Society and Neuroscience Program, which we feel is a groundbreaking initiative. It's several years old now, and the presidential refers to our former president, President Bollinger of Columbia. The program promotes cross-disciplinary research, mainly by sponsoring postdoctoral scholars and their mentors, and funds research projects. So our seminars, conferences, and events such as this is really designed to foster collaboration and innovation. The program is housed in the Center for Science and Society, which is a dynamic hub bridging the traditional disciplines and advancing public understanding of science. So if you want to stay informed, in the next slide, which Joseph will click, there's a QR code, and you can sign up for our newsletter and also watch the recordings online. So this is going to be recorded, actually, if you want to go back to it. And you can, those of you online can join the discussion by using the Q&A tab on your Zoom and upvoting questions. If you're in person, please raise your hand at the end of the talk series, and someone will provide you with a mic. So we look forward to your participation in this. So the Presidential Scholars Program owes a lot of its success to its leadership. There's a steering committee, and faculty across the university are actually part of the advisory committee. And then, of course, we have our mentors and scholars. So your commitment, all of you who've been involved and participating previously, have made the PSSN, as we call it, a model of interdisciplinary excellence. And some of our scholars, if you can go to the website, have gone on to have wonderful positions in academia, but ones that foster interdisciplinary science. So without delay, I'm going to introduce one of our scholars, Paul Linton, who is actually the designer of this event. So Paul is currently a postdoctoral scholar in Nico Krikis-Korte's lab, and that's in his group, which is in the Zuckerman Institute. He's also a fellow of the Italian Academy. Dr. Linton taught philosophy at Oxford before earning his PhD in vision science. So he's a vision science and a philosopher at once. And he specializes in 3D vision. He's the author of a book, The Perception and Cognition of Visual Space, and the editor of the Royal Society volume, New Approaches in 3D Vision, which just came out. He advances in this book new theories of visual scale and visual shape.
Let me just say thank you to everyone who's involved in this. So everyone at Presidential Scholars, everyone who at the Italian Academy, at GSAP, at the Zuckerman Institute, and at Stephen Hall Architects. And in particular, can I please say thank you to Joseph, Caroline, Marissa, and Matali, who've just been excellent. Okay, so why are we holding this event? There's two reasons. The first is virtual reality, right? So Meta and Apple have both announced their headsets, and the promise of virtual reality is that it's going to replace all of your 2D screens, right? So it's going to replace your televisions, your phones, and your computers. And the question is, how are we going to get from here to here, right? And the answer is we need 3 revolutions. We need a revolution in technology, and that's happening. We need a revolution in AI, and that's happening. But third, and just as importantly, I would argue that we need a revolution in design. So the analogy is this. When computers were first introduced, we had to develop from scratch a way of interacting with them. And that challenge exists today with virtual reality, right? It's no good simply putting 2D screens in 3D space. And so it's a real honor to have Nitzan Bartov here today, who brings together these two fields, teaching architecture at Columbia whilst working on design for Meta. But underlying this question is a sort of further, deeper question about how we experience space in the first place. And here there's sort of 2 general approaches. So on the one hand, if you ask an architect how do we experience space, they'll tell you to read Stephen Hall. And if you ask Stephen Hall, he'll tell you to read the French philosopher Maurice Merleau-Ponty. But on the other hand, how we experience space is something that we're also working on down the road at the Zuckerman Institute. Indeed, the 24 Nobel Prize was on exactly this question, right? How we encounter space in the world. And so it's a real honor and privilege to have sort of 2 of the premier representatives of these 2 different ways of thinking about space. So in his teaching over the last 40 years at GSAP, and through his theoretical work, Stephen Hall has been a premier champion of the phenomenological approach to architecture based on experience. He's also built up a practice of architecture that's primarily focused on developing buildings which are, in every sense of the word, phenomenal. On the other hand, Anjan is a neurologist by training, who specializes initially in sort of spatial deficits and spatial experience related to physiology, and has now developed sort of the leading approach to neuroaesthetics and neuroscientific approaches to the brain. So to introduce Anjan Chatterjee is the founding director of the Penn Center for Neuroaesthetics. He wrote The Aesthetic Brain, co-edited 3 books, Brain, Beauty and Art, Neuroethics and Practice, and The Roots of Cognitive Neuroscience. And he received the Gershon Prize in Cognitive Neurology by the American Academy of Neurology and the Arnhem Prize for contributions to psychology and the arts by the American Psychological Association. He was the founding member of the Board of Governors of the Neuroethics Society and past president of the International Association of Empirical Aesthetics and Behavioral Cognitive Neurology Society. He serves on the board of the Global Wellness Institute and served on the boards of the College of Physicians of Philadelphia, Haverford College, and Associated Services for the blind and visually impaired. Please welcome Anja.
I'm going to start out with a problem. And the problem is that we are an old brain trapped in a new environment. And what do I mean by that? I'll start again with the problem, which is that we are an old brain trapped in a new environment. And by that I mean most evolutionary psychologists think that the configuration of our brain evolved during the Pleistocene, give or take 2 million years, in which this is the environment in which we, our species, existed and evolved. This is very different than this, which all of you are around. And so the question is, what do we do with this? And once we get to our talk on the metaverse, it completely stretches, at least my imagination, to how we take this old brain into a hyper new environment. And I'll be very curious about that. The point of this slide is to say that, as Paul mentioned in his introduction, there is a kind of convergence between neuroscience and architecture that's happening. But that convergence is somewhat asymmetric in the sense that I think architects, at least some architects, have gotten interested in neuroscience, but relatively few neuroscientists have gotten interested in architecture per se. So people study 3D vision, people study navigation, people study perception, people study our motor systems, all of which is relevant to architecture, but relatively few people study architecture directly. Okay, so the story I'm going to tell you began about 12 years ago. This was a collaboration. It was an international collaboration. My friend Ocean Vartanian, who's in Toronto, led this study. There were architects and investigators at Copenhagen involved. Some of the study was done in Spain. Data were collected in Tenerife. And for this first study, it was the first little tap on the door of architecture for us was asking a very, very simple and a basic question, which is the experience of architecture, the pleasure that we might get out of architecture, our response to beauty in architecture, does that tap into the same reward systems that our brain responds to very basic things like food and sex? So it's a very simple question. We started with these kinds of stimuli, which were curated by architects in Copenhagen, and we're interested in, at least at a first approximation, looking at three variables, which is our ceilings high or low, our interiors rectilinear, curvilinear, so this is kind of a curvilinear space, and is the space open or closed? And by open, we mean you can see past the enclosure. So this would be a closed space, for example. And what we did was we had people in a scanner, an fMRI scanner, and the basic question was, what is the response to beauty in architecture? And the answer is very simple, which is that little dot you see is within parts of ventromedial prefrontal cortex. It's a classic area that is involved in rewards and the apprehension of rewards, or the counting of rewards, and that the core question that we were asking was answered to say that our appreciation of beauty in architecture taps into the very same kind of primitive neural systems, primitive, but basic neural systems that deal with our basic pleasures such as food and sex. Okay, so that was kind of in the background. So a few years later, there was a graduate student who was getting a PhD in architecture at Cambridge who wanted to do some empirical work in my lab. And so he came and kind of combed the literature to try to understand what kind of questions in the psychological, in psychology and environmental and landscape psychology, what kind of questions were people asking? And we came up after having gone through this literature with about 16 of these kinds of dimensions. And so what we did was a large online study where people were shown the exact same images we used for the original study. We had about 800 participants, and they were responding on these dimensions, to each of these individual images. And once you do that, you can do certain sorts of things, this is something that is referred to as a network analysis, a semantic network analysis, where you look at how the people are responding to these dimensions are related to each other. So it's kind of showing the dimensional space of these responses, and what it looked to us like is that there were three core dimensions, three core categories, components, whatever you want to call it, that all of these responses cohered into, which we're calling coherence, fascination, and hominess. And right in the center of that is valence. And valence is the most basic question of do you feel good or do you feel bad? So it seems right in the center of these three components. And we went on to do a more kind of conventional principal components analysis, and we find, sort of the same thing. In fact, 90% of the variance of everybody's responses, and for those who don't think in terms of variance, that's a lot of variance, is accounted for by these three components. Okay. So we replicate this behaviorally again in a new group of people, we get the same finding. So then we do something that it's the only chance in my life, and probably the only chance ever in my life as an experimentalist, to do what is the equivalent of a double-blind study, which is, since we had used these exact same stimuli in the study that was done at this point something like 8 or 9 years before in Tenerife, our data, these data were all collected in the US. But we had the imaging data from those participants back then, and they had seen the exact same images. It's double-blind in the sense that we had not identified these components at the time, and the participants certainly wouldn't know what the components were. So we went back and reanalyzed their data using these dimensions to kind of look at whether there was a neural signature. Now, we didn't have a motivated hypothesis for what that might be, but the idea was, is there a biologic reality to what we're seeing behaviorally in a completely different population when we didn't even know to ask the question? And because I'm setting it up that way, the answer is, of course, yes. And within visual cortex, I can go over the specific areas that there is a segmentation of how our visual brain is responding to these three different components. And it's key to know that we didn't know that, they didn't know that, this response was there. And by inference, I would say that we are always responding to the built environment, even when we are not explicitly aware of it. We spend more than 90% of our time, at least in the materially developed world, we spend more than 90% of time in the built environment. And yet this, surprisingly, in psychology and cognitive neuroscience, has not been a big domain of interest or of inquiry. All right. So in this was a smaller study in which we looked at people who were neurotypical, people who were on the autism spectrum, and design students, and looked at the same kind of question. And what we found was that, most notably, that for people on the spectrum, on the autism spectrum, fascination didn't seem to matter, at least in the way that we defined it for neurotypical population. And from that, we are guessing that since fascination, this component, is related to visual complexity, density, that this actually becomes overwhelming for people on the spectrum rather than something that feels salutary. We also found, and it's not so clear in this, but in this and other studies, is that design students and architecture students overemphasize coherence compared to other people. And that might be worth talking about later in the Q&A. I'll be curious about our architect experts, what they think about that. So far, the studies that I've shown you were using these very curated set of stimuli, so we decided to extend this to stimuli that we hadn't picked. So these were stimuli that we used from an investigator named Ed Vessel, who was looking at landscapes and exterior architecture. So these were not selected by us. We ran people through the same thing. And here the question is, are these three components that we're finding, do they generalize? Do they generalize to the outside of buildings, and do they generalize to natural landscapes? And what we find is yes, but with kind of a caveat, which is with exterior architecture, we still get these three components. With natural landscapes, with natural landscapes, we get a kind of a conflation of hominess and coherence. And if you look at that in detail, what we find, actually this is so small I can't read it, but what we find is that within exterior architecture, people tend to find appealing a sense of naturalness. And within the exterior, within natural landscapes, people like a certain degree of order, which is, you hear a lot of biophilia has become a very popular term, that people love nature. Well, nature is not nature is not nature. Nature can also be scary. Nature is undifferentiated when sometimes people talk about it. And what we seem to find is that there's a permeability between our space inside and our space outside, where we like some of the outside in our spaces and some of our inside in the sense of some orderliness outside. And then the final thing is to give us some confidence about this. So Hugo Spears, who's at UCL, picked up on this and did a completely different paradigm where people are navigating in these videos through different environments, and they basically replicate these same three components and particularly show that fascination is more related to arousal. And of course, as an investigator, this is always very reassuring when a completely different lab finds the same thing using completely different methods, completely different stimuli, to suggest that there really might be something generalizable. And so my final slide is going back to where I started, which is, what do we do with this when we live in this? And so there's a body of research from about 50 years ago, and the names that are particularly prominent are Appleton and the Kaplans. And if you kind of comb through that research, there are three things that come out of what they think was important in terms of our preference for natural landscapes. And those are prospect, refuge, and mystery. And we were not thinking of that when we started this line of research, but it is somewhat reassuring that prospect means how well you can scan the environment, is somewhat similar to coherence, how legible is the environment. Refuge is, do you feel safe in that space, which is, we think, at least a close cousin to hominess. And mystery and fascination seem like they're also quite closely linked. And so what I would argue is that it might be the case that these three components really are fundamental to how humans react to spaces around them. And the expression of that might vary depending on the environment itself. And leave it there.
Well, thanks so much, Anjan. And now to move on to our next speaker, to introduce Stephen Hall. Stephen Hall was born in 1947 in Bremerton, Washington. He graduated from the University of Washington and pursued architectural studies in Rome in 1970. In 1976, he joined the Architectural Association in London, and in 1977 established Stephen Hall Architects in New York City. Stephen Hall was named by Time magazine as America's best architect for creating buildings that satisfy the spirit as well as the eye. He has realized cultural, civic, academic, and residential projects in the United States and internationally. He specializes in seamlessly integrating projects into context with cultural and historic importance. Stephen Hall has been recognized with architecture's most prestigious awards and prizes, notably the Premium Imperiale Award for Architecture, the AIA Gold Medal, and the Reba Jenks Award. Stephen is a tenured professor at Columbia's Graduate School of Architecture, Planning and Preservation, and has lectured and exhibited widely, as well as published numerous texts. Please welcome Stephen.
Well, I'm surprised to be here. Somebody said, would you give a lecture on phenomenology? I said, sure, yeah, I'm part of the university. But Paul's introduction was more interesting than my talk, so I'm looking forward to the argument that we're going to have over here, whatever we're going to do. But for me, Dr. Chatterjee's most exciting image was the brains, where you saw those 3D brain scans and you could see the synapses. You could read that the whatever environmental thing that was happening now can be read in the brain. I often give my students a quote from Winston Churchill: first we shape our spaces and then they shape us. That was a long time ago, 1944. But now, with neuroscience breakthroughs that we've had in the last 10 years, we can say that's true. And therefore, architecture, needs to change because it's more important than it ever was. So my talk really here is more historical. It's, my first book, Anchoring, I said I came to sort of the front row in 1989 when I had a show at the Museum of Modern Art and I hadn't built anything. It was really scary, so I wrote a manifesto called Anchoring. I said, forget postmodernism, forget deconstruction. A building should be related to its site and its circumstance, and it should make a meaning that's unique to the site and circumstance. Okay, then I said that was flawed. The thing about writing a book is you actually think about it very deeply, and it was well received, and it's still in print. But I said that's flawed because the site and the circumstance are unique. There must be things that are general to every condition, no matter where. And then I was, like Paul said, I was reading Merleau-Ponty. All that stuff. Anyway, I was changed a little bit by reading about phenomenology, and I thought those are dimensions of philosophy that can really be applied to architecture. And I wrote this with Hani Palazzo and Alberto Perez Gomez, and it went through 3 publications. But basically, it was speaking about all the things that are general to every situation, like enmeshed experience, the merging of object and field. Zebras can, camouflage themselves from hunting lions because of their stripes. The problems of color that are unique to site and circumstance. The spatiality of night. Dr. Chatterjee's image of Times Square is actually very different at night when the water is covering the pavement and it's just a sparkling environment, very unique. The question of time. Everybody faces that. And for me, I grew up in the Pacific Northwest on water. So water, for me, is a phenomenal lens. Our bodies are 70% water. The earth is 70% water. It's something I think really adds. And the problem of sound, acoustics, like we've had here tonight. But I really must say, I really love this space, this sort of the curvature and the wood. And the questions of sound, and the questions of detail. And architecture, the first time you encounter a building, you put your hand on a doorknob or a push-pull or something, so that the sense of the material and the detail becomes immediately something that you experience, and it becomes part of the story. Proportion. All of my work, and that's particular to my idea, is mathematically 1 to 1.618. The golden section is a very old and unique number, and it's found in everything in pine cones, the solar wind, all through nature. This is a diagram of Mies van der Rohe's famous Farnsworth house. It's just a series of golden sections in white steel and glass. So, in detail then, the Chapel of St. Ignatius, which I'm very proud of in my hometown of Seattle, was all about experience in color. And it's made out of 7 bottles of light, and it responds to the spiritual exercises of the Jesuits. I'm not a Jesuit, I'm not Catholic. I do believe in the potential of the religiosity of space. I think that in architecture, and I know I've felt this, that you can go into certain spaces and you can feel the aura of some spiritual religious presence from before or in history. I studied in Rome, and I love to go to the different churches of Rome. Anyway, this was a concept drawing that then we executed, and Father Jerry Cobb at the Jesuit, he was part of the campus ministry that was the client. He described to me St. Ignatius' spiritual exercises, where you would go away for 3 weeks, and then you would say something, and then somebody would say something back. So it was this give and take. So I was thinking about the phenomena of our sight and color. If you stare at a blue rectangle and you turn and look at a white wall, you see a yellow rectangle. if you stare at a red rectangle and you turn and look at a white wall, you see a green rectangle. That's happening with the cones and rods in your eyes. It's a phenomenal thing that we all experience. So I made the whole building out of these spiritual exercises, these reverse. So there was a field of yellow and a lens of blue, and a field of red and a lens of green. And it's sort of, if you go there, it's really it's magical because it changes when the clouds go over, it pulses. The different times of the year, the sun is a different angle. So it's a phenomenal experience. And I'm very proud that it won the 25-year award at the AIA. It's to me, the most important, which is a building has been there for over 25 years. It still means something. And the university understands the concept because on their website, they even talk about these contrasting colors. And also, we use color at the Maggie's Cancer Care Center in London, where in this case, we were speaking about music. It's the center of London, a very difficult site to work on. I won't go into it in detail, but it's a very simple concept of a thing within a thing within a thing. In the center is a bamboo kind of a basket. There's a concrete hand-like frame, and then there's a musical notation that encases the whole building. And that's all in natural bamboo. And you can see these Noom notation lenses glowing from the daylight when you're on the inside. And then at night, and I don't have that view, but they glow from the inside out. So it has a presence at night. It's a very sensitive, historic place in London. But this idea that music has a kind of, I think architecture, architecture and music are very close together. Dr. Chatterjee compared these emotions to sex and food. I say music, and that's not sex and food. It's music and architecture are related, and they are human needs. Like Osip Mandelstam said, we need poetry like we need bread. I believe we need music, as we need architecture. And water, a phenomenal lens, a case. This is the Kansas City. This is the Nelson Atkins Museum in Kansas City. You can see it's a skylight that the water moves. And then another example is the extension of the Kennedy Center in Washington, D.C., our most probably difficult and important project. The Kennedy Center is a living memorial. The other memorials in Washington, D.C. are more monuments. This is activity 360 days a year. And it's a really interesting project that way. And it's based on a musical analogy of glissando. When you run a bow over a violin, you hit all the notes. Raphael Montistello here is a composer. He's been a consultant on how many projects? Like 4 or 5 projects. Every time I try to make the analogy to music, I bring him into the office and he says, no, that doesn't work. You got to be. Anyway, he's very tough on me. And I want to get to a point at the end here, so I'm not going to go into this. It's a wonderful project. If you visit it, it's more about the landscape and the experience between the pavilions, and it's really hard to show as an image. It's not an object, and it's not a style. It's really about the entire garden and the landscape. And this clicker, this thing doesn't seem to work. Yeah, it goes back and forth. Okay, so. Well, we have definitely, when I'm speaking about phenomena, about space and light, and we have a technical problem here, and I wonder how the poor virtual reality speaker is going to handle this. This is going to be very hard on her, and technology fails, it just fails. It fails. It's just a failing stuff, right? It's stupid in a way, And we have 6 people working on the controls here. I've never been in an auditorium where there's more than one person taking care of the technology, but that should prove to you that if technology fails, it doesn't matter how many people you have. If it's going to fail, it's going to fail. So anyway, it looks like I can't go any further than that in my talk, but I have something I can read. Luckily, I brought a book, and it's a book that connects me to Dr. Chatterjee. My last book, which just came out in 2019, is titled Compression. And I was inspired because I gave a talk at the Salk Institute with Eric Kandel, the neuroscientist Eric Kandel. And he had just written a book about art and the mind. And his argument was the abstraction is important. It's important for the mind to be able to make something out of, like a poetry that has a double entendre. So abstract art, and in his book, he's speaking about abstract art. So I took his thoughts at that Salk Institute, and I talked about architecture. And I wrote a text, and this book tries to connect my buildings to neuroscience. And there's a text I wrote called Architecture Activating the Brain. It's a little bit like that, what I said about Churchill. And this lecture was presented in 2016 at the Salk Institute. Speaking was the great brain scientist Eric Kandel, who had just published Reductionism in Art and Brain Science. Kandel argues via neuroscience that the brain needs abstraction. The internal mechanisms with which we see and experience visual and physical phenomena depend on a bottom-up approach, not a top-down, building up from the elements of abstraction, the opposite of a top-down approach of given figuration, which stifles the imagination. And then another chapter is called Environment, Body, Brain, and Mind. And I really wish I could have that last image. If there's any way this thing, oh, it's starting to work now? Ah, well, there's a project I collaborated with Gene Heistine, and it was for the snow show. It's made out of blocks of ice, oblong void space, and it's a beautiful thing about light and space and material, and then it totally melts and disappears. In March, it was in Rovaniemi, but I really like that. You couldn't be more ecological than that, you know. Blocks of ice, and then it just melts and waters the landscape. It's a fantastic piece of architecture. And that's the Institute for Advanced Studies in Princeton, a place dedicated to thinking and thought. And that was the concept diagram, that it would be an intertwining of nature and science and mathematics, and you'd be able to walk in one end of the building and through the building to the other and experience these water gardens and different landscape elements. And it's also close to their idea of the whole institute there. That's where Einstein did his last work in 1955. He died in Princeton. It was a competition, and it's a very important project. When and there you see the idea of intertwining right from the beginning, the concept that you would be able to see water gardens almost like they were pushing the plan to be less important, and the water and the nature was more important. And then the spaces have a kind of, idea of space curves. That's an Einsteinian thought. So I had to check it with the master, and of course, Le Corbusier had met Einstein, so I had a meeting, and they said, okay, go ahead, build it. And it's a very important site in Princeton. And there's, up here on the upper left, is Einstein's last office in Fould Hall. And there was models, and they used chalkboards. I was so glad to see these chalkboards here. This is great, right? I mean, I asked the scientists, do you like to use whiteboards with it? No, we don't like the smell of benzene. We don't like the smell of those markers. We want slate. We want chalk. I mean, these guys are, some of the smartest people in America, right? So then I said, aha, I'm going to put slate walls everywhere. I have the whole building has got slate walls, and they love it, so, and that goes back to the great master. Now, just to finish, I was editor of Domus thanks to our dean, André Jacques. I couldn't have done it. He helped me, and during that time, I really got into, I made 5 issues, and I'm not going to get into, only in the first one. It was called The Oceanic. And this is about what our topic is today, consciousness. The problem is about consciousness, really. The theoretical physicist Carlo Rovelli, who is great, by the way, you have to read his books. argues that today the problem of consciousness has taken the place of what in the past used to be the meaning of soul, spirit, subjectivity, intelligence, perception, understanding. However, we as humans, without alien figures to measure ourselves against, are only left with ourselves or animals to compare what is our consciousness. Ravelli writes that of the 10 most important books on the nature of consciousness, number 2 was Other Minds, The Octopus, the Sea, and the Deep Origins of Consciousness by Peter Smith. Octopus, now, there's an animal that has brain neurons in all 8 of its legs. They think. Maybe there's a way to understand consciousness. Anyway, that was a great experience. That will be another lecture. I'll do the whole Domus thing. And this is the Salk Institute. I already did this part. And that's Eric Kandel. Wonderful man. I think he's the greatest neuroscientist after Dr. Chatterjee, of course. And that was my diagram that I said. You have the environment. And I drew this in Santorini. It was so beautiful. It was like you see the blue sea all around and the little white buildings. As I'm drawing this, I said, I feel so wonderful here in Santorini. And then I said, then there's the human body, you know, this one is getting old. And then you have the brain, and then you have the mind. Now, the mind thinks stochastically, and that is not quantifiable. And I have this whole long text about stochastic thinking, and actually one of my Domus magazine editorials was about stochastic thinking. And it was really interesting to me when I gave the talk that the director of the Salk Institute said, that's exactly what we do as scientists. Thank you.
Wonderful. Thank you, Stephen. Well, from the mind to the matrix, to introduce Nitzan Bartov. Nitzan is a designer, educator, and media artist, exercising design fiction to explore beauty in the flaws of the digital world. Her works were presented at Tribeca, South by Southwest, and Sundance film festivals, and were covered by Wired, The New York Times, The New Yorker, The Economist, and others. Nitzan is a designer at Meta Reality Labs Research and an adjunct professor at Columbia's Graduate School of Architecture, Planning and Preservation, where she teaches virtual reality and world building. She has a bachelor's in architecture from Tel Aviv University. Welcome, Nitzan.
Hi, all. So I am Nitzan, as I said, and tonight we're going to talk about designing virtual spaces for tangible bodies. In this exploration of virtual space making, we're going to consider space and body in virtual simulation and the ways VR invites us to rethink that relationship. I'm going to discuss this issue through the lens of architecture, speculative design, and world building, and I'm going to bring in industry and student work examples. So, sorry? Yeah, so let's take a step backwards before we're diving into virtuality. Let's talk about reality. Reality from Wikipedia, the sum or aggregates of all that is real or existent within the universe, as opposed to that which is only imaginary, non-existent, non-actual. This definition is fascinating to me because it already contains this full spectrum of what's reality and kind of acknowledge the importance of that non-existent, non-actual, imaginary space in human experience. It as fundamental, that possibility is fundamental as what is defined as reality. So now let's dive into virtual reality, though we're gonna go back and forth through this talk. So who here heard about VR? Cool. Anyone here tried VR before? Wow, very impressive. Anyone working with VR? Okay. Virtuality is the quality of having the attributes of something without sharing it, real or imagined, without sharing its physical form. virtual reality is a simulated experience that employs pose tracking and 3D near-eye displays to give the user an immersive feel of the virtual world. So let's look at VR from within. In a VR simulation, the user finds themselves in a 3D environment that enables them to interact with their virtual surrounding in a way that approximates reality as it perceives through their senses. So when we're talking about senses, we're not only talking about eyes, we're talking about your entire proprioceptive system. We're talking about, or in future, we try to sometimes talk about touch and what that might be like. We're talking about spatial audio, and we're trying to use all these senses to make your virtual experience more tangible. Enabling technologies for VR in its contemporary manifestation are VR headsets and game engine software. What we're seeing here are illustrators in VR using Google's Tilt Brush software and Vive headset and controllers. With pose tracking in their hands, for their heads and hands, through the controllers, they can move and create in 3D. What's fascinating about this software, they're able to do this so naturally, but there's no situation in real life where you get to sculpt the same way you get to sculpt with this software. And somehow every learned skill that you've gained in reality has prepared you for that moment to just intuitively understand that concept and form of creation. But maybe the last slide is getting us ahead of ourselves. We see artists already in motion, simply creating. As architects and designers, we're used to start our work with a series of constraints, be it client needs or physics itself. Our tool sets and thinking practices are set for solving problems for this reality. In virtual reality, how might we overcome the blank page anxiety? Where do we start from where do you start from when you seemingly have endless possibilities? I don't have an answer, but I want to take you through the process I go through with my students here in Columbia, where we are learning to use our new tool set to explore possible answer. Okay, so let's go back to reality again. We can think of our built environment as representing the limits of this world's physics and material properties. To us, this is an environment governed by familiar and predictable laws, in the image gravity, acting on an apple. In our world, cause and effects are so clear, they're hard to explain. Using the unique affordances enabled by game engines, in our studio, we explore speculative architecture adaptive to alternative physics, materials, and causality. Who here is familiar with the term game engine? Okay, so what's critical for this talk, game engine is the software you use to basically create VR experiences. It allows you to create 3D interactions, similar to 3D modeling tool, but it allows you to create interactions in real time, and that's the critical thing. So real time, meaning frame after frame, it keeps adjusting to the position of your head and body and update the simulation. So fundamental facet to modern game engines is their physics engine. This component of simulates certain physics systems, such as rigid and soft body dynamics, collision detection, and fluid dynamics. For the use, it's used in the domains of computer graphics and video games and film. This definition invites us to think about an older term that's kind of regaining popularity in last year of world building. So the term appeared in late 1800s, but a kind of more modern appearance. The term appeared in Arthur Eddington's Space-Time and Gravitation, an outline of the general relativity theory to describe the thinking out of hypothetical worlds with different physics laws. The terms have been used in science fiction and fantasy criticism writing since the 1960s. But it goes way back to thinking about possible physics and how these fundamental laws influence our experience. So what happens if we change one parameter in this physics simulation, but be it a fundamental one? What might architecture be like? We don't need to go too far. We have amazing physical phenomena all around us. But the exercise to do is making that kind of outlier a principle for our world. Could you imagine zero gravity Manhattan? What would it feel like to inhabit that space? How would we interact with objects around us? In our course, we start going back to that empty blank slate of the game engine. Where do you start from? We're starting from an inspiration. It could be from art, it could be from film, but my favorites are just looking around us and finding natural phenomena. So this is a slow motion recording of magnets. The students there then prototype a very simple behavior based on that source of inspiration. And after that behavior has been prototyped, they'll try to create a world where this new makes sense. This is actually an image of an actual architecture. And the last stage, or depending on the project when this happens, but you can think that the last stage is visiting this world. So what does it mean? We're bringing back the human body to the equation after kind of taking it out, and think, what would it mean for us to interact with it? So start sharing student projects right now, and hold your fingers, that video is working. So this is YY10's project for 2020, taking inspiration for touching dried dandelion petals. This is a very early prototype of what that might be like. Well, so she took that natural inspiration, translated to a script, and explored what it would mean in the surrounding of her own home. This project was done in 2020 during COVID time, where students were all at their home all the time. Some projects that came out from that period are really moving, and you could see how students kind of use this process to explore their personal experience. Another thing we can notice here is that that magic of the interaction with dandelion petal is translated to everyday artifacts. What would it be, along with this beauty, if we're thinking a little bit deeper of does it feel like to inhabit this sort of place? How would you know? Is it Midas touch? Is only certain objects react that way? Would they have a specific look? And also, imagine being surrounded with dandelion petals all day. Maybe it's a nightmare. Okay. Next project. Okay, so this project is really, so if we started from the hand and sense of touch, and how do we bring that sense of touch that is not exactly virtual reality, this project brings in another sense. So this is kind of, what if we would have this sonar, discover the world through this sonar vision experience. So you're sending out audio waves, and through them you're starting to discover reality around you. The reality you discover is visually simplified, divided to distances, and also, could we replay? But there's something visually appealing and relaxing in that experience. Something I really like here is also visiting the space feels like traveling to something else. It's not built around the senses the way you're used to see them. You use your existing senses in a new way. Next project. Right. So we had first project explored touch, second project explored senses. This project explores object interaction. So what you see here, it's a little hard to understand from the video, but where the cube, the plane that the cube goes to, that's where how your reality aligns. So can we replay that? Maybe the clip is too short. So where your own cube falls to is where your reality aligns to. And there's something really interesting to me in this cube companion relationship that's created here. And again, student projects are very initial, but we're seeing here an interesting proposition of human-object relationship and what they might do for us in virtual reality. Next project. Okay. Okay. Could you go to 2 minutes 80 seconds or 2 minutes 2 minutes-ish? I think I have a note. Yeah, 2 minutes 8 seconds. So this is a beautiful student project from this year. In this project, you're an absolute visitor to this beautiful, beautiful landscapes of light mirror, actually taking whatever physics engine offers you and bringing it up to 11. So you have reflections here, you have light, you have rainbows, you have magic voices, and you have, barely hear. Okay, you can't hear very much. I think previous scene you also heard the sound of the footsteps of what it might sound like walking in this space. So this is less thinking. I mean, the body is present, but this is more like visiting an out of this world space, an enhanced environment. I think are we running out? Okay, so let me wrap up. Okay. Okay, so in his manifesto towards new architecture, Le Corbusier describes the primitive men building a camp. There's a beautiful scene there where he talks about how the primitive man brings his chariot to a stop. He chooses his land and he levels it the best way he can. He creates a road to the riverbank and makes it as straight as he can. And when he builds his fence, he regulates his steps and measure it with his arm the best way he can. So primitive man is using his own body to make sense of nature, which is for Le Corbusier this strange space that's very estranged to human, not necessarily body, but definitely perception that is looking for this order. He says there's no such thing as primitive men. They're primitive resources. The idea is constant and full sway from the beginning. So if we agree with Le Corbusier, maybe we can start feeling comfortable with this fresh blank space where we get an opportunity to kind of project our own order and sense of being too. That's it. Thank you.
So if everyone's comfortable, just any thoughts you had basically on each other's presentations, if there were themes, common themes between them that sort of jumped out from your work and from theirs.
I would just say that, you know, the possibility of parallel universes coexisting is something exciting. You know, when you started the evening, you were doing a this versus that kind of thing, right? Well, I would say no. I would think that, you know, everything that's technologically possible is something interesting. You know, the Bartlett School of Architecture has a program, a Department of Virtual Reality Investigating Architecture. So, you know, I mean, there's phenomenal reality, there's virtual reality, there's hybrid reality, maybe there's like 5 realities. So we don't want to cut anyone short, right? I mean, I think, yes, why not? I mean, I really like that last project where there's reflection on the horizontal plane and all these lights are coming down. I mean, that was the most interesting for me because it was something very creative. That was a student work, right? Yeah. It was a very creative effort, and I think that's what the university is about, right? I mean, it's not this versus that.
Anjan, any reflections?
Yeah, I think what mostly I was sensing from your presentation was a sense of play, that, you know, you have to be practical, people have to live there, and you're dealing with materials. But this was very playful, and it feels like there's a kind of generativity there that allows for creativity in a way that is less constrained than kind of what we have to deal with. And that, you know, so that opens up all sorts of possibilities. With your presentation, you know, one of the questions I always think of or wonder about architects is when you're starting, you have a kind of imaginings or a prediction of the future, right? Architects are predicting the future. They're saying, I'm going to do this thing, and this is what people are going to experience.
If you get the commission.
If you get it, right. But so, and that seems like an extraordinarily powerful and responsible thing. There's a weight of responsibility because these aren't things that you know, you do it and it's hopefully going to last 25 plus years or many more. And I wonder if you could comment about that, the weight of responsibility of predicting the future of how other people are going to experience the space.
I just enjoy the unknown and the sort of not quite knowing what you're going to do. You know, there's a 1817, Keats had this theory of negative capability. That is to take all the problems that surround you, you know, like we have forests burning up and flooding and this and that, to just take all the problems that surround you and then make something creative. You need negative capability. And then the joy of creating something that you don't quite know what it is. So I think the key to it is playfulness. You know, to play. When you're working in the beginning, you have to play around and making all these watercolor sketches all the time. It's a form of play. And virtual, whatever way you want to play, whether it's models or whatever. And then when you really come down to building it, of course, you have to make all those engineering things work and everything. But in the beginning, there's a certain joy, and that's what's great about a school of architecture, you know? And that's why I love to teach. You know, Dimitra Zaccarelli and I teach a class called Architecture Apropos Art. So we really encourage the students to play around with a language that somebody like Lino Bobardi had, 30 years ago, what kind of furniture she designed, what kind of buildings did she design, but to somehow form something of their own, like a creative act, just playing around. And you know, a lot of things come out of that, but I think that's why I love teaching, because I think you have to be open-minded and continue that unknown, that the feeling of the unknown. I mean, you must have it in science too, where you're discovering something because you're playing around, you're trying things that you weren't quite sure you were doing. And I mean, we know the history of DNA came about in a dream, right? I mean, the Watson and Crick's 500-word text tells about the dream of a snake swallowing its tail that broke through the scientific DNA intertwinement. I know that's an old story, but...
Well, yeah, and even an older story is that, Aristotle said that all knowledge begins with wonder. And
Exactly.
I think that's what drives a lot of scientists.
Right.
And, you start out trying to be wide open and not be too hampered by our own thinking.
Right.
So
Actually, I'm very lucky to be with a woman who's all about trying something new. So we tried even AI, like design, architecture with machine intelligence. So I plugged into the system. I had to do 35 buildings. It's a long story. It's a stupid project in the Middle East. Anyway, I couldn't do 35 buildings in 2 weeks. So I plugged in Stephen Hall and Mies van der Rohe and come back in about 3 minutes, all these designs. So I chose a couple and we developed them and I made a couple pavilions. It was interesting, but we did it in like a day, right?
Your students are all taking notes.
I know. Try it. I mean, I wouldn't recommend it. It's like marijuana. I smoked it once.
And Nitsa, any thoughts?
I really loved Steven's project with the colors and the visual illusion. I watched it and I was like, oh, this is what we're doing, basically. This is what we're trying to do, to play with your senses, to enhance your senses. And that's, of course, what architecture is trying to do, but I think we've gotten used to that, and seeing your project really kind of reintroduce that possibility of playing with the senses in a very intentional way. That felt exactly like the thing we're trying to do in VR when it's good. I was curious with your talk about, did you ever get to take users through 3D? With that, visiting an actual building versus the perceived image of a structure? What?
Yeah, that's a great question. So, if you've ever done an fMRI study, just so you know what that's like, people lie flat on their backs, and if they even move half a centimeter, all you get is noise, right? It is the worst possible, the most ecologically invalid way to study architecture, right? Which is all about moving through space. In fact, it's probably the only worthwhile study that I've never seen done is to understand the experience of being in a coffin, right? That's what fMRI would be good for. So having said that, we still do get these kinds of results that I think are meaningful and they resonate. And I think there's a way in which our brains are, you talked about abstraction and Eric Kandel's notions of abstraction. I think we take something and we experience them as events, right? So you can look at a black and white picture, you've never seen something black and white, and yet you see it as reality. You see a flat thing, you see it as reality. And I think our brains are very good at doing that, right? We hear words, but we hear meaning. We don't really hear words. We don't hear the phonology that linguists will tell you about. So I think we apprehend the world at a level of abstraction that helps us with this sort of thing. Now, having said that, the hope is you either take our studies, you take neuroscience into the field, or you bring the field into the laboratory. So we are starting to do some VR studies as a piece of that, but really the technology would be using things like mobile EEG or infrared spectroscopy where you can go out in the field. I think it's not quite ready yet to ask interesting questions, but I think that's where it's going to go, where we can actually go out into real spaces.
Fantastic. So we're going to cheekily try and fit in just a couple of questions. So if anyone has any questions, Joseph's going to... Oh, we've got some over here as well.
Amazing. Thank you for the talk. This is a question for Stephen Hall. It's very rare when we get an opportunity to fit both the architect of a theoretical framework, and someone who that framework could apply to at the same panel simultaneously, so I want to take advantage of that. The conception of coherence, hominess, and fascination seems like a very interesting framework that we can view architecture as architecture students through. And I wanted to ask you about a specific project because it's related to the research that we're doing in our studios today, the water treatment plant that you designed in the early 90s in Hamden, Connecticut, if you're familiar.
Right.
Yes.
1992, you're going back in time, okay.
It's a great project, very relevant. And so I was wondering if you had an idea or had an opinion of where that would fit on that matrix of coherence, fascination, and hominess.
Well, it's not going to be in hominess. It's going to be in fascination. But 90% of that building is underground. So it's landscape, really. And I did it with Michael Van Balkenburg, landscape architect. And the reason that I got to do a water treatment plant is the community in New Haven was made up of architects. All the people that were in the houses around this big water treatment plant said, you can't just build a bunch of metal boxes here. This is our community. So they had a kind of competition or interview process, and I made a sketch about the idea that 90% of it would be underground, and the entire thing would be like an upside-down water drop. It was a very cartoonish sketch. And then we executed it in this long building that actually contained all the spaces that need light and ventilation. And then down below, there's all the water treatment system. So it turned out to be, and it's the first project that we did with geothermal wells. There are 88 geothermal wells. You don't need that many wells. I mean, now I've done my archive with a single geothermal well, 500 feet deep, that heats and cools 3,000 square feet, no problem. So the technology is completely advanced for geothermal. I really think it's the future for, in this climate, it really works perfect for heating and cooling. But yeah, that project, I haven't been up there in years. Were you up there recently? Oh, okay, great. Well, that was also because of the architects in the neighborhood. I think Kevin Roach, there were 8 architects that had houses in the surrounding neighborhood, and they said, you got to have a piece of architecture there. So that's a rare chance. Thank you for bringing it up.
So I think we've got one here, and then I've been told we've got time for potentially 2 more questions if people have them, but we'll be quick.
Mr. Hall, I want to ask a simple question about AI. As you said, AI can achieve something even a famous architect like you cannot attain. So as an architecture student who haven't built anything, I might should have more pressure. So how do you think about this threat from AI to creators, to innovators? Do you think it will deeply threat the related fields? Yeah.
What you mean, like what will happen to AI in the future?
Yeah.
I had the Architects newspaper ask me 2 questions. What will architecture be in 2043? In 2 sentences. And what will media publishing be in architecture media be in 2043? So I said, I hope in 2043 we'll have fossil-free buildings with wonderful natural light and natural ventilation, and in urban configurations that were unknown and very exciting. But I didn't use the word AIA. I just imagined that you would probably have to use that to get to that source. And then for publishing, I said that architecture publishing should be more focused on social and philosophical and artistic and not be so commercially manipulated. So they're going to hate me for that. They advertise curtain walls all the time, it's all full of ads. Anyway, so that's as close as I can get to answering. 2043 is a long ways from now.
Yeah, so I think we're permitted one last pressing question.
Hi, how's it going? So I really liked what you said on architecture as a human need, like music. And Dr. Chatterjee was talking about responsibility. And so I was just wondering, and I had a thought that in contemporary architecture, I feel like the building also has, we have a responsibility towards the building because buildings have a crucial role in the health of the world. And so I was wondering if you had any opinions on how we might mediate designing space for our mental well-being, but also for the biological well-being of the Earth, and if those two can play together, or if one has to be prioritized.
No, I believe firmly that natural light and natural ventilation, I think there's been studies, especially in Scandinavia, done that mental well-being has to do with understanding the time of day and the time of seasons. So natural light in rooms is crucial. You know, it's a kind of, that's a very, and now we could probably do synaptic studies to check, you know, when someone's locked in a windowless place, you know, what happens to their mind versus someone that has a much more enjoyable and natural relationship to the spaces. So I think, you know, like I started with the thought that architecture is at a threshold because neuroscience is advancing so far right now. Therefore, it's a very optimistic moment. You know, that's what Dr. Eric Kandel keeps saying. You know, we're in a very amazing moment in scientific discovery in neuroscience, and therefore it should have a bearing somehow. I don't know how we're going to make it be usable so we can convince clients, don't build that crappy thing that you're doing, make something really great, you know.
If I could just add to that, I think as an outsider, it strikes me that in the last 15 or so years, architects have been appropriately preoccupied by sustainability, and this is kind of the health of the planet, like that kind of approach. I think there has been less attention to the biology of the organism in the buildings, which is humans, and that, you know, how the built environment contributes to our well-being, not just our health, but our well-being, and that's why I think aesthetics ends up being important. And the key to me would be how you can converge aesthetic considerations with sustainability ones. A lot of sustainable architecture is, quite frankly, ugly, right? You feel good about it, but it's not that appealing to be in. So to me, that convergence is going to be key.
Great. Great statement. Boy, can we print that in the architecture program?
Sure.
I can't say that.
I
said that once, and they put it all over. They said, Stephen Hall says that sustainabilities are ugly.
But it to be that.
Exactly what you said is correct. And there's an overreaction. Certainly, everything has to be as ecological as possible, but that's not the whole picture, you know. And that's partly the problem of teaching today. That people just they ignore the poetry, the space, the light. You know, that's the well-being. Mm-hmm. Great, wonderful. Come and teach with us.
Thank you. Thank you, everyone, for coming, and thank the speakers.